Today we are going to talk about another issue related to the practice of medicine or biomedical research, which is confidentiality, especially in the era of AIDS and the right to know. Now, back in 1987, the Baltimore Sun newspaper in Baltimore, Maryland, came up with a piece of information that a pregnant lady was walking in the street when she was shot in the middle of the street in a fight. The paramedics were called to the scene, and then they started to do the medical emergency measures to that lady and transferring her to Johns Hopkins Hospital. Now, in the emergency room at the hospital, all the emergency staff started to work to save that lady. And then, by the way of doing certain investigations of blood tests, came up that the pregnant lady was HIV positive. وهذا اللي حصل الآن. What the hospital can do in this case. مسؤولة المستشفى الإعلامية قالت إنه كل واحد مسؤول على الحفاظ عن نفسه، وبالتالي إحنا we are not responsible or we are not required to release any information related to the HIV status of the pregnant lady. But this incident raises the following questions. Now, where are the limits of confidentiality? The second question, who has the right to know that they may have been exposed to HIV AIDS? Another question comes with whose responsibility is it to inform sexual contacts of HIV AIDS patients? Now, the other question, can public health policies be framed to prevent the spread of disease while protecting the civil and the human rights of its victims? Which means that is there any policies that save both parties, which is the society, from the spread of the disease and the patient by protecting his information? Then, where is the limits of confidentiality? It seems that there are limits for confidentiality. Remember, we talk about Tarkos-Pass model that the patient has to release information or intimate information about him or herself, and the physician is required to keep them. Now, keep them unlimited, or it seems there are limits of confidentiality, especially in certain diseases like AIDS. Now, the rule of confidentiality is that physicians are ethically obliged, this is the rule, not to release to a third party any information about the patient that was obtained during the course of treatment. Not information about patient obtained in the market or in the street, but just during the course of the treatment. So any information related to his medical condition. The ethical justification for confidentiality are, so what they say is supported by by the patient's right to control personal information and protect the privacy. I'm responsible to protect the privacy of the patient. But this becomes extremely important when breaching confidentiality leads to discrimination against them, deprives them from social rights, or bring physical or emotional harm to them. So the importance of confidentiality becomes so clear if we notice that when the confidentiality is breached means إفشاء أسرار المريض تؤدي إلى تمييز ضده، تحرمه من حقوقه المجتمعية، وتؤذيه physically و emotionally. هذه نتائج بتترتب على when the confidentiality is breached. هل لو أفشينا هذه المعلومات ممكن تؤدي إنه هذا المريض يصير discriminated against him or her, or deprive them from the social right, or bring physical or emotional harm to them. This is the first principle, which is the patient's right for privacy, to keep his information confidential. The second is that the moral relationship in medicine. هذه الأخلاقيات العلاقة اللي قائمة عليها مهنة الطب، إنه the patient is required to reveal intimate information، وبالمقابل MD is required to keep them. The third one is that without guarantee of confidentiality, what would happen if we cannot guarantee confidentiality of the patients? What would happen? What would happen is that patients would not seek medical help. And this is particularly true with high-risk groups, especially those with sexually transmitted diseases. If I am not guaranteeing confidentiality for them, not to breach confidentiality, then they might refrain, or they might stop going to the physician to ask for help from those diseases which are stigmatized against. Nobody likes to know anybody to know that he has sexually transmitted disease, for example, or he has epilepsy, for example. Now, programs designed to encourage voluntary testing are the most effective approach to prevent the spread of AIDS. They tried so many programs to prevent the spread of the disease, like AIDS, and the most successful program was that program that encouraged voluntary testing. Means that the patient voluntarily go and test his HIV status voluntarily without any force, which is a proof that compulsory testing means the patient will not go to seek medical help and they will be without help. Now, some ethicists argue that while confidentiality is moral obligation based on the previous facts, yet it can be overruled by more compelling moral obligation. So there is a moral obligation. This is what they say, those ethicists. There is a moral obligation, but yet there is a more compelling moral obligation. قوي والأقوى. بالتالي, which one to pursue? Is it the moral obligation or the more compelling moral obligations, such as what? Such as the child and incompetent patient who would be harmed by confidentiality. And cases involve a threat of violence against identifiable third parties, which means that if I know that a patient is psychotic who has tendency to harm himself and to harm others, it means that if I am keeping the confidentiality, this others, maybe his wife, his children, identifiable third parties, could be harmed if they are not warned that this patient can harm them. This is where more compelling obligation. Okay, I'm obliged to keep confidentiality, but if I see the situation where a potential harm is waiting for identifiable third parties, like from a psychotic patient, then this is overruled, or confidentiality is overruled by a more compelling moral obligation. I am morally or more morally obliged to prevent harm from those identifiable third parties. Again, cases involving contagious sexually transmitted diseases where third parties will be harmed or placed at risk if information known to physician is not disclosed. Now, those are innocent parties. The third parties are innocent parties, and I know that this patient has contagious sexually transmitted disease and has the potential to put harm on other innocent people. Can I keep this information confidential from those parties and expose them to harm? This is what is called a more compelling moral obligation, that there are innocent people, and by keeping confidentiality, I am exposing them to harm. And children and incompetent patients, they don't know anything, they are the weak parties, and also could be harmed if confidentiality is not breached. Personal autonomy and individuals' right to confidentiality is then limited by what is called the harm principle. So there are proponents for confidentiality that, okay, I'm morally obliged to keep the information, and the patient has morally obliged to provide intimate information and have to keep them. And the moral relationship in medicine also is built on around this. But the opponents for confidentiality say, okay, what if there are innocent people and keeping this information confidential might exposing them to harm? So this is an issue between two parties we need to resolve. The opponents of the confidentiality came up with what is called the harm principle. The harm principle means that moral agents, I'm talking now in general, كل واحد عنده أخلاق، سواء كان health worker ولا patient ولا parent ولا society. إذا الأخلاق تحتم عليك required to refrain from acts or omission which would result in what? In a preventable wrongful harm to innocent individuals. Means that دائما بنتحلى بالأخلاق معناته إحنا مطلوب منا أخلاقيا to refrain, to stop، نمتنع عن القيام بأي عمل أو إخفاء أي حقيقة acts or omissions اللي من شأنها would result in a preventable wrongful harm to innocent individuals. أخلاقياتنا بتقول including أخلاقيات المهنة الطبية. Now, if this is the case, if the harm principle is this, then strict observance of confidentiality cannot be ethically justified in all cases. In some cases, yes. But again, here we can see that confidentiality cannot be justified ethically in all cases, and those who do not breach confidentiality, look at this. Now, the physician who is not breaching confidentiality may be guilty of negligence because he omitted certain information from innocent others and exposed them to harm. By doing so, then you might be guilty of negligence. Now, before accepting this conclusion, we need to clarify the force of the harm principle within the context of the ethics of aid. Now, the argument did not stop by the harm principle, but again, the ethicist decided to look deep into the harm principle within the context of any contagious disease, including the AIDS. Now, refining of the analysis of the conditions may justify breaching confidentiality of the antibody status of the patient, which means that we need to analyze more deeply the condition that may justify what conditions that justify breaching confidentiality about the HIV status of the patient. Then the analysis extends to what's called the vulnerability principle. Vulnerability principle. Now, if we look to the proponent of the harm principle, بيقولوا إنه moral agents are morally obliged to refrain from act or omissions of any information that might lead to preventable wrongful act, which means that we are morally obliged to avoid harm from ourselves, to prevent harm, to protect people against harm, and if there is a harm on any patient, we are morally obliged to remove him. So avoid harm, prevent harm, protect against harm, and remove harm. This is the harm principle criteria. Now, the critique for the harm principle is that not all acts or omissions that result in harm to others appear to be wrong. تذكروا اللي حكيت لكم إياها إنه واحدة شوكت بقطعة لحمة وفي طبيب قاعد وراح عمل stabbing wound to open an airway, the trachea. This act is definitely harmful, but is it wrong? Now we are trying to differentiate between acts that are wrong and acts that are right, given that both of them are harmful. Even when we give a needle or a shot for the patient, it is harmful. But is it wrong? We do operation for the patient. Blood and everything, remove organs from the patient. Now, it is harmful, but it is wrong. So we need to, the critique for those who criticizing the harm principle say there is not all acts or omission are wrong. Some are wrong, which is negligence, and some are right. Then why some acts are wrong and others are not? The obligation to protect against harm, this is the refining of the harm principle is that the obligation to protect against harm is only valid when there is a person who is vulnerable. So he is defining that not all harm principle, not all acts or omissions according to the harm principle are wrong, but only when we see that there is a vulnerable person, which means that he is or she is at risk or susceptible to harm, then this harm principle is valid, which is called the vulnerability principle, because we notice that there are certain people who are vulnerable and certain people who are not vulnerable to the risk. And only the vulnerable, in this case, the harm principle applies, not to the invulnerable. Vulnerability means both relative inability of the persons to protect themselves from harm. Clearly, the person cannot prevent himself from harm. Then he is vulnerable. And second, a correlative ability of another individual, which is clearly is the physician here, who, by act or omission, would place the vulnerable in harm or remove them from harm. هو يقرر مصيره إنه يتعرض للأذى ولا ما يتعرضش للأذى simply because he is able, by act or omission, would place the vulnerable person in harm or remove them from harm. So these are two conditions that need to be met in order to say that This is a vulnerability principle, which is a more refined form of the harm principle. More refined form of the harm principle, saying that, okay, there are a person who is relatively unable to protect himself, and there is a person who, by act or omission, can help him or protect him from harm. If one of those is not available, then this is not vulnerability principle. And since there is no one who is completely invulnerable, now we refine or the analysis further by saying that, okay, how much vulnerable he is. He's 90% vulnerable, 60% vulnerable, 30% vulnerable, which means that there is no one who is completely invulnerable. But the vulnerability is relative. And we said that is relative inability of the person, not absolute. Then vulnerability principle only applies when one party is especially vulnerable, and clearly the children and incompetent patients are clearly vulnerable. The parties are unequal in their power to protect their own interests, which means both parties are unequal in their power to protect their own self. There is powerful and there is not powerful people, like the children and incompetent are not powerful or weak, but there are parties who are powerful. And again, the psychotic example is typical in this case. Psychotic patient is the powerful person, and the children and the incompetent, the wife and others, less powerful to protect themselves. Or inequality in knowledge that gives one party an unfair advantage over the other. And this is typically the case of AIDS when there is the innocent people, like the wife, or if the wife is HIV positive, will be the husband, who one has the knowledge about the HIV status, the other one does not have this knowledge about the HIV status, so it gives unfair advantage to those who know. So in this condition, the vulnerability principle applies when the parties are unequal in power and the parties are unequal in knowledge. Children are vulnerable. Again, we discussed the polio vaccine. Can the child prevent? Can the parent, can the father cannot vaccinate his child against polio? Is he free? You know, the child is vulnerable, the child is weak, the father is strong. He decides whether to take the child to vaccinate him against polio or not. In this case, vulnerability principle applies. Applies means the father is obliged by rules. And again, the case of Massachusetts is clear when it put the society at risk of polio and the vaccination of the child, then the society take the upper hand, which is we are more morally obliged to protect the society than respecting the privacy of the father. Again, adults in certain instances are mature and can protect themselves. So in certain instances, this is why during the era of AIDS, or since the era of AIDS now came SARS, Ebola, and all these similar things. The rule in medicine that you are obliged to treat each and every patient as if he or she is an AIDS patient. So, adults, including physicians, are mature and can protect themselves, so you are obliged to protect yourself with whatever measurable preventable measures required for this case, and each patient has to be treated as a patient, wearing mask, wearing gloves, wearing all these protective measures. You are mature, you are adult, and you are capable of protecting yourself. بالتالي you are not vulnerable. You are not vulnerable to the disease, وبالتالي confidentiality does not apply to you, which is a refining part of the harm principle. بقول لك no, we should refrain from acts or omission for all persons. The vulnerability principle says that no, adults in certain instances are mature and can protect themselves, وبالتالي we cannot provide confidentiality for them, or we cannot breach confidentiality to protect them. Now, the argument goes further, and this is theoretical. Protective measures are not always feasible. If you go to the emergency room, sometimes if you are faced with so many casualties like car accidents or fights or whatever, now you work in atypical environment of emergency. You are doing everything regardless or without due caution to what the status of those persons are. I'm not talking only about AIDS, I'm talking about hepatitis B, for example. What if you have a needle prick from a patient who has hepatitis B? Now, MDs in the emergency room are not protected because of the situation they are in. The gloves might tear, and the only way to protect themselves is to refuse to work. This is the only way to protect themselves, is that stop working, which is not the case again in medicine. So even the vulnerability principle says that those working with the blood might be informed while others are not. Even in the emergency room, even in the lab, in the x-ray, in the ward, for the nurses, for the pharmacist, for anybody dealing with that particular patient who is HIV positive, means that only those who are working with the blood of that patient will be informed or may be informed, while others are not required because they are mature and they have to protect themselves. What about the HIV positive fiancé? Now, HIV positive males خطب واحدة HIV negative، أو واحدة HIV positive انخطبت لواحد HIV negative. What is the role of the partners? For release of information about the HIV status of the partner to the other, basic questions need to be answered. The first question to be answered is that, is the individual to be notified is someone who is especially vulnerable? Now بنحكي عن خطيبته، شرعا زوجته. هل هو vulnerable? This is the first question we need to answer. The second question we need to answer, is he or she someone who faces significant risk of exposure to infection from the partner who is HIV positive, which seems yes. Will revealing confidential information assist them in reducing this risk to themselves or to others? وهل لو أفشينا سر هذا المريض أو ال HIV status لهذا المريض للشريك، هل يساعد هذا الشريك بخفف الريسك تاعه؟ This is what we call breaching confidentiality. Does it assist in reducing the risk to themselves or to others? Which seems, yes, in the case of HIV positive fiancé, all the questions are answered with yes. And in this case, if yes, then information has to be released and confidentiality has to be breached because we are helping or protecting, preventing harmful, wrongful harm to other innocent people who are vulnerable. Sometimes there is no clear-cut answer. No clear-cut answer. And the issue remains confidentiality versus harm principle and vulnerability principle. Sometimes. Now, where to go from here? Those who are standing on the side of the harm principle says that if we are not sure, then it is safer to err on the side of confidentiality. بمعنى انه اذا مش متاكدين احنا اسلم لنا ان نغلط بالconfidentiality مش بالharm principle. بمعنى وكأنها الconfidentiality أقل درجة من الharm principle morally. طبعا المعارضين شو بيقولوا؟ إذا كان هذا الحكي صحيح معناته إحنا we are underestimating confidentiality. قللنا من قيمة الconfidentiality اللي أساس العلاقة بالطب كلها مبنية حولها. إحنا إذا دائما الحالات اللي مش متأكدين منها دائما نغلط لصالح الهارم برنسبل against الconfidentiality. هذا مش صحيح لأنه in this case we are underestimating the confidentiality. Now there are two types of errors we make. إذا بدنا نغلط في two types of errors we make. First, disclose information for those who have no right for it. وهذا أول خطأ ممكن يصير من التيم اللي بيشتغل على البيشنت هذا. We might disclose information to those who have no right for it. Disclose confidential information to those who are not harmed, who can protect themselves, who are mature and are obliged to protect themselves. وبالتالي this is one error. And the second error is that we fail to disclose, again, confidential information for those who have the right to know it. أو نفشل في إفشاء الحقيقة لناس الواجب يتحتم علينا إن نخبرهم. والخطأ الأول disclose information، نعطي الحقيقة لناس مش من حقهم يعرفوها. Now prevent harm to patient versus to society. This is the dilemma. This is the dilemma. As we said before, how can frame a rules or a policies that protect the patient against discrimination and helping the society from the spread of the disease? في conflict of interest between the patient and the society. If we breach confidentiality, then the patient is going to be discriminated against him in schools, in housing, in employment. He will be psychologically harmed, he will be physically harmed. And remember, an innocent child, he is hemophiliac. Because of blood transfusion at that time, he got HIV. He was HIV positive status. When the parents of the other children knew that there is HIV positive child sitting with their children, they stopped sending their children to school unless this child is kicked out. This is what we call discrimination. If we breach confidentiality for employers about this patient, he might not employ him. Even the neighborhood, if somebody is HIV positive, all the neighborhood will be harming him and discriminating against him. So by breaching confidentiality, these are the consequences of breaching confidentiality to the patient: discrimination in schools and housing, employment. The treatment for this is to keep confidentiality so as not to be harmed. Now, by keeping confidentiality, then we are helping the spread of the disease. And to prevent the spread of the disease, we need to release information about the HIV status of the person. In this case, whom to harm. It seems one of them is to be harmed. Now, what is the common theme in this case is to release information to prevent the spread of the disease, but to set policies against discrimination. Who's going to discriminate in schools or housing or employment? There are rules and regulations that prevent him from discriminating. The employer has no right to refuse a patient or to employ a patient with HIV positive based on HIV status. These are the common theme for uh, in dealing with confidentiality. Thank you.